Before we can begin installing and even discussing Active Directory domain services, there are some terms we have to understand because during the install, you're going to see some of these terms show up. And once your install is done and you go to the Active Directory service itself, you're going to have to be familiar with these terms before you can start managing objects or creating users or anything like that. These terms are broken down into two categories. We have logical components. When I say logical, I simply mean design. It's based on your needs, however you choose to design your overall Active Directory structure. And then on the other side, we have physical components. These would be servers. They would be determined by your physical locations within the environment itself. So logical and physical. The logical side, the first term we have is domains. Then we have domain trees. Now that's often just called trees. We have Active Directory forests. We have organizational units, which is always just called OUs. We have these containers. We also have domain controllers, which are just servers, like physical servers in the environment that have this Active Directory domain services actually installed. And we do have a special category of domain controllers called read-only domain controllers, which maybe you deploy to a branch office, but nobody could log into that domain controller and manage anything within Active Directory itself. So just a read-only copy of Active Directory. In this lesson, we're going to break down these terms. A domain is a repository for user accounts, computer accounts, and other objects like groups you can create within the domain. It also serves as a replication boundary, and it is an administrative boundary. The server that actually runs the Active Directory domain services software, the server you installed it on, that is called a domain controller, which we will refer to as a DC. The way this is designed, you have your domain controller. Now I'm just going to put DC, and as we said, DC is just the server with, I'm going to say AD for Active Directory, installed. So you install Active Directory on this server now becomes your domain controller. When I go to the Active Directory software, I can create users, groups. You can join computers to the domain. Now, we will collectively just refer to all of those as objects. So those are the things that you can create, manage, delete within Active Directory itself. The domain controllers, you will always have more than one in a production environment. The reason is they replicate with each other. So this is the replication boundary. I'm going to say this is domain controller A and domain controller B. I can log into domain controller B and I could create a new user on domain controller B, and that user would then replicate to domain controller A. You could rename the user on domain controller A, and that change would then replicate back to domain controller B. So they are exact replicas of each other. Does not matter which one you use to create an object. Now, the benefit to that is it gives you fault tolerance. If domain controller A needs to be rebooted during the day, or it has some type of failure, maybe the hard drive failed or something like that, and it goes offline, not a big concern because domain controller B has an exact copy of all of those objects, so my users can still log in. Everything still works within our environment. From an administrative point of view, it's also an administrative boundary. Every domain has a group named domain admins. If we make you a member of this group, you can manage everything within this actual domain. So I could manage all the users, the groups. You have full control over all of those objects. Now, the logical symbol for a domain is always going to be a triangle. So in this example, my domain name here is rts.com, and that's just what this triangle actually represents whenever you see that show up. No, you're just looking at a domain in the image itself. To recap domains, the big takeaway is that a domain is a replication boundary, it is an administrative boundary, and it's a repository for all of the objects. We also have a forest. A forest is a security boundary. One or more domains that share a trust relationship with each other constitute a forest. The trust relationship is between domains, and it allows you to access resources in other domains within the same forest itself. The way that's designed, I have a domain, rts.com. I have a child domain named india.com. We have the atlantis.com, US Atlantis, and I have this ca.atlantis. So let's say this is all one company. RTS is one division, Atlantis is another. The way this is actually structured, I'm going to have domain controllers in each of these domains. We already talked about the administrative boundary and the replication boundary. Let's say rts.com. That's our headquarters for the RTS division. We'll say this is in New York City. So all the users that work in New York City, they have their user accounts reside on these domain controllers in New York City. They replicate with each other. I have administrators here. And they manage every aspect of the users, groups, computers, servers within New York City in that rts.com domain. But we expanded some time ago, and we have a location in India. With that location in India, we decided we wanted to be separate. I'm going to have domain administrators in India. They will be responsible for managing all the users, groups, computers in India. So I have two domain controllers here in India. As we said before, if you create a user on one domain controller, it then replicates to the other, but only within the same domain, because as we established, a domain is a replication boundary. Now let's say you have a file server in India, and on that file server, you have a shared folder. I'm just going to say the share is named sales. In this example, I have users in the rts.com domain, and what they ultimately need is access to this shared folder that's on that file server in India. This is where the trust relationship comes in. This blue line represents the trust relationship. Now, I'm just going to put arrows on it. So what this actually means, you have one domain in India, you have another domain in RTS. They are completely separate domains. They are administered separately. They contain different users, groups, all those things, different from one to the other. But there's a connection between the two. All this trust means is that if a user in New York City needs access to a folder in India, I can grant that through that trust relationship. So I could simply go to that sales folder and I could say, I want to add this user or this group from the rts.com domain. And when I do that, I could give them read access or whatever level of permissions they need to that folder, and they would be able to access that folder. So that's all a trust actually means. You can access resources that you are assigned permissions to in other domains within your forest. Everything we just said would also hold true on the other side of this graphic. So I have Atlantis.com, I have a US child domain, and I have this CA or Canada child domain. Each one has its own set of domain controllers. So domain controllers in the same domain as we said, they all replicate with each other, and we have these trusts between the domains themselves. Now, if you look at this picture, the way it actually works, you can access a resource from anywhere in this graphic because there's a trust between US and the Atlantis.com. There's a trust between Atlantis and RTS. So ultimately, you can be assigned permissions to any resource anywhere in this forest, regardless of what domain you are in, regardless of what domain the resource is actually in. Now, this brings up the question, why would I ever do this? Let's say in Atlantis.com, you have 40,000 users. And if you have 40,000 users, you're probably going to have about 40,000 computers. And you have groups and all these other types of objects that exist. I don't want to replicate that to India if I'm in Atlantis. I don't want to replicate that to Canada. So what we can do is say, this only replicates within that Atlantis domain. Now let's say this is in the UK. Those objects only replicate between domain controllers in the UK. In the US, let's say you have 7,000 users. Now, those objects only replicate between the domain controllers in the US. As we said before, a domain serves as a replication boundary. So that will be true of every other location. So I'm not replicating objects from Atlantis to India to the US to Canada. Domain's going to be our replication boundary. But because of the trust, we can still access resources in any of these other domains. My main benefits to this, as we said before, replication and administration. We just discussed replication boundary, so I don't need to mention that again. But for the administration, each of these domains has administrators in each respective domain. So if I am in the Canada.Atlantis domain, I have administrators that manage all of those objects. If you are in India, you have no access to the users, groups, computers, anything in my Active Directory in the Canada domain. And same is true of every other domain. So administrative boundary, replication boundary. The way Microsoft defines a forest, if you only have one domain, you actually have a forest. It is just a forest of a single domain. So if you have a domain, a forest is always going to be present. Seems a little odd to some at first, but that's the way Microsoft actually defines a forest. The other term we're interested in is tree. When you look at this graphic, we have rts.com and I have india.rts.com. With the India, just rts.com is just appended to the back of it. This is a tree. The rts.com tree. A tree is a parent domain and any child domains associated with it. On the other side, we have Atlantis. And then we have the CA Atlantis and the US.Atlantis.com domains. This would be a tree. The Atlantis tree, we'll call it. So right now, what I would say is if we count these, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 domains. I have 2 trees, the RTS tree and the Atlantis.com. So we'll say 2, and I'm going to write domain trees, although it's just usually called trees. And in this graphic, we just have 1 forest. So 1 forest, 2 trees, and 5 domains overall in this graphic.